Someone rips your bag out of your hands and you scream. And 10 minutes later, there's an officer standing in front of you, writing it down. The next few weeks bring case files, a court date, and a lawyer billing by the hour until finally a judge who has never met either of you decides what happens to the person who ran off with your stuff. That's a genuinely enormous machine, built just to process one stolen bag. Rewind 20,000 years. No badge, no paperwork, no courthouse, no law written down anywhere on the planet. Same crime, though. Someone just took something from you, maybe food, the thing you actually needed to survive this week. Or, worse than theft, maybe someone hurt you or broke a promise that genuinely mattered. Nobody's wearing a badge on their chest. No siren in the distance. No holding cell waiting on a judge to decide anyone's fate. None of it exists yet. Written law is still about 15,000 years away. Professional police, the kind writing you a ticket right now, try 19,000. So what actually happens to the person who just hurt you? Take a guess. Maybe you're picturing chaos, you handling it yourself however you can, in the heat of your own anger. Or maybe you figure nothing happens at all since there's no police to step in. You'd be wrong. Completely wrong. What actually happens next works well enough that some anthropologists will tell you with a completely straight face that it functions better than a lot of what we've got now. And the harshest punishment on the books? Not death. Something that makes death look merciful by comparison. Here's the first surprise. Hunter-gatherer bands ran for hundreds of thousands of years with zero police, zero courts, zero law written down anywhere. And yet researchers who actually lived alongside these groups kept reporting the same thing. Over and over, relatively peaceful, surprisingly equal, nobody lording it over anyone else. Not paradise, just working, in a way that shouldn't be possible if you believe the old story about human nature. In Leviathan, published in 1651, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that without a strong enough authority to keep people in line, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That was his case for why humanity needed a centralized power to stop people from tearing each other apart. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau swung the pendulum so far the other way, it's almost funny. Humans in their natural state were gentle, barely capable of real violence, and it was civilization itself that ruined everyone. Both of them wrote this from the comfort of a European study, centuries after actual hunter-gatherer life had mostly vanished from their part of the world. It's a bit like writing a restaurant review based entirely on your grandfather's stories, having never eaten there yourself. And the archaeological evidence doesn't really side with either man. Large-scale, organized warfare, the kind Hobbes imagined lurking behind every tree, turns out to be fairly rare among small hunter-gatherer bands. Most conflict stayed personal, small-scale, not zero. Just nothing like the free-for-all Hobbes pictured. So if nobody was forcing people to behave, and it wasn't because everyone was born gentle either, what was actually going on? In 1993, the anthropologist Christopher Boehm published a study in the journal Current Anthropology, drawing on dozens of small-scale, relatively egalitarian societies across Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. Not just hunter-gatherers, but simple tribal societies too. He called what he found reverse dominance hierarchy, which sounds like a wrestling move, but is actually more interesting than that. In most other primate troops, from chimpanzees to baboons, someone always climbs to the top and pushes everyone else down. Human hunter-gatherers, according to Boehm, found a way to flip that entire script. The moment someone started acting like they were better than everyone else, the group shut it down. Not with violence, at least not at first, but with something almost as effective. Mockery. A skeptical look, quietly getting left out of conversations. Nobody waited for a bully to become dangerous before acting. They stamped it out while it was still small enough to laugh at. So how did that actually play out day to day? What kept ordinary people, not tyrants, just people who slipped up, in line? It starts with something so small you'd almost hesitate to call it a punishment at all. Picture the smallest hunter-gatherer camp you can imagine. Maybe 30 people, all of whom know each other. Now try to imagine dodging accountability in that setting. You can't. Everyone gossips constantly, and everyone quietly keeps a mental file on everyone else's behavior. Who shared food fairly last winter? Who didn't? One bad decision doesn't just embarrass you for an afternoon, it can follow you for years. A kind of proto-criminal record without a single filing cabinet involved. That's not a small thing. That is the entire justice system, running purely on conversation. In 2023, the researchers Nicole Hess and Edward Hagen published a study in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, testing this across three very different groups: office workers online in the US and India, Ngandu farmers in the Central African Republic, and a smaller group of Aka, hunter-gatherers living nearby. With the first two groups, participants read positive or negative gossip about a fictional person, then were asked whether they'd hand that person a resource, a raise, an inherited heirloom, a few shirts. The results matched almost eerily. Positive, context-specific gossip made people more willing to give. Negative gossip did the opposite. With the Aka, there was no experiment, just direct questions about real people in their actual daily lives. The pattern held there too. A good reputation got you shared with far more generously. And remember how leaders had no actual power to order anyone around? This is their entire arsenal. A leader who starts throwing their weight around doesn't get arrested. They get talked about, endlessly, until the group quietly turns away. Rung 1. But what if a bad reputation isn't enough? What if someone keeps taking more than their share, keeps hurting people, and the group's disapproving stares stop working? What happens next is a lot more serious than most people assume. Serious enough that the death penalty, strangely, starts to look like the merciful option. Anthropologists have documented the same sequence across dozens of small-scale societies. A ladder for dealing with someone who won't stop causing harm. Rung 1, gossip, didn't work. Rung 2, public shaming out loud, no privacy, no dignity, still not enough. Rung 3, ostracism. You're still physically present, but socially you no longer exist. People stop including you, stop sharing with you, stop looking at you when you talk. And if even that doesn't work, the next rung is exile. Complete removal from the group. Here's the twist almost nobody sees coming. Researchers studying ostracism in small-scale societies don't shy away from calling exile what it functioned as: a social death penalty. Not a dramatic exaggeration, a fair description of the actual odds. Think about how hard it actually was to survive alone back then. No stored surplus to fall back on, no neighbors a few houses down, no hospital if you got sick, nobody keeping watch while you slept, nobody to help fight off a predator at 3 a.m. In a world that unforgiving, being cast out alone didn't just lower your odds of survival, it collapsed them almost immediately. A slower death than execution, but in most cases, just as certain. Which raises an obvious question. If exile was basically already a death sentence, why would any group bother with actual execution at all? Because sometimes exile doesn't make the danger disappear. It just moves the problem to a different camp. In 1979, the anthropologist Richard Lee published the Kungsan: Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society, based on years of fieldwork with the San people of the Kalahari. His records include 2 men, Gao and Tui, who went from difficult to genuinely dangerous. One of them was described by another member of the group, word for word in Lee's own notes, as being like a lion. He eats people. Shaming didn't work on them, exile didn't stick, because they kept coming back, kept escalating further. So the group did something extraordinary. They arrived at a shared decision together, and they acted on it together. Not a mob, not one furious individual taking revenge on his own. A consensus. That detail matters more than it might seem. Decisions like this almost always required the group's agreement, partly to keep a grieving relative from starting a fresh cycle of retaliation. Sometimes the group assigned a relative of the offender himself to carry it out. It sounds almost cruel, but it's actually the opposite. Taking revenge on your own family is a far harder thing to justify. So keeping it inside the family was exactly how you made sure the story ended there. So yes, execution existed, but it sat at the very bottom of the ladder, not the top. A genuine last resort, only reached after gossip, shame, and exile had all already failed, and only with everyone's agreement. Quick question before we keep going. Which system sounds fairer to you, your ancestors, or the one running your neighborhood right now? Leave your answer in the comments, genuinely curious what people think. Which leads to the next obvious question. If an entire community had to agree before anything serious happened, who actually enforced things on an ordinary day? Was there anything resembling police? In a small band of 30 people, the honest answer is nobody. That job simply didn't exist. But scale the group up. Gather a few hundred people for something big, like a communal hunt. The whole camp's food supply for the season depends on getting right. And something close to an actual police force shows up. In 2022, a study published in the journal Public Choice examined how several Great Plains tribes, including the Cheyenne, used organized warrior societies, most famously the Dog Soldiers, to keep order during large, high-stakes communal buffalo hunts. Their job was to make sure hunting rules were followed and the meat got divided fairly. A single impatient hunter charging in early could scatter an entire herd, costing hundreds of people their food supply for the whole winter. And they didn't just issue warnings. Break the rules, and the consequences were real and immediate. Your robe torn apart, your lodge poles destroyed, or in the worst cases, your horse confiscated and destroyed. In a world with no rental cars, that's roughly equivalent to having your ride repossessed in the middle of a road trip. It sounds harsh out of context, but when one selfish act could threaten the whole community's winter, it worked exactly the way modern policing is supposed to. Clear deterrence, actually enforced, protecting the group. But here's what makes this genuinely interesting. This wasn't a permanent ruling class. During a hunt or another high-stakes collective moment, the Dog Soldiers' authority was close to absolute. The rest of the time, keeping order in camp was still their job. But it was a rotating duty passed between warrior societies, not a private privilege one group held forever. No dynasty, no badge you kept for life, no power that stopped answering to anyone. Big communal hunts were fairly rare. Most disputes were small, personal, easily forgotten. So, on a completely ordinary day, with no Dog Soldiers around, who actually settled things? Most of the time, it was the older members of the group, people who'd built up decades of trust, not from a title, but because their judgment kept turning out to be right. Elders didn't rule from above. They guided, brought both sides together, and pushed the group towards something that repaired the relationship, instead of just punishing one side and calling it done. You can still see a living version of this today. The Navajo and the Sioux use peacemaking circles, structured dialogue that brings the person harmed, the person who caused the harm, and the wider community into the same space. The goal is a resolution, not a verdict handed down from above. Some modern American courts have started borrowing pieces of this model because, in certain cases, it produces better outcomes than a traditional trial. Similar systems exist across Africa. Councils of elders remain one of the continent's most trusted institutions for resolving conflict. Among the Kipsigis of Kenya, a council called the Kamasian handles everything from land disputes and marriage to the most serious matters of life and death. It's still active today, running alongside the formal court system because people trust it more. But here's the question you're probably asking by now. If these elders or councils had no formal power to force anyone to do anything, no police behind them, no jail to threaten anyone with, why did people listen? Because they weren't really answering to one person. A group leader, an elder, a council head, none of them could give an order and expect it obeyed just because they said so. What they had was the group's backing. Ignore a decision the whole community agreed on, and you're not defying one old man. You're defying everyone. In other words, power never actually lived with the leader. It lived with the crowd quietly standing behind them. Don't get the wrong idea, though. This wasn't a perfect conflict-free paradise. Pretending otherwise would undersell how genuinely sophisticated these systems actually were. In 1968, the anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon published Yanomami, The Fierce People, one of the most detailed records ever compiled of how a small-scale society handled conflict. Among the Yanomami of the Amazon, he documented an escalation ladder governed by strict, agreed-upon rules, not chaos. It started with chest-pounding duels. One man bares his chest, the other lands a series of open-fist blows on it, then they switch roles. Not resolved? Escalate to side-slapping, open-handed blows to the flank. Still unresolved? Club fighting. In the most serious cases, a supervised spear-throwing contest, genuinely frightening, but calculated down to rules precise enough to satisfy a demanding lawyer. Every level had agreed-upon rules set in advance, an audience watching, something like ancient bleachers, and a clear structure for knowing when the dispute was over. Most importantly, the whole system existed to prevent something worse: actual retaliatory raids, conflict with no rules, and no exit. A fight, however painful, was still something contained. The community saying, "Settle this here, under rules everyone agreed to, instead of somewhere else with none." Cyclical retaliation between families, sometimes lasting years, genuinely did happen. In 2022, the researchers John Halstead and Phil Thompson published a study reassessing violence levels among hunter-gatherer groups, drawing on both archaeological and ethnographic data. Their estimate, prehistoric hunter-gatherers died from violence at a rate of roughly 100 per 100,000 people per year. That's far higher than the modern global average of around 8 per 100,000, and higher than the homicide rate in almost any American city today. So, going purely by the numbers, these were generally not gentle, low-violence societies. But that same research uncovered something stranger. The violence wasn't evenly distributed. Remember Gao and Tui, the two men from Richard Lee's records? A review of SAN records logged 22 violent deaths over 35 years. In a community of only about 400 people, 13 of those were tied directly or indirectly to exactly those two individuals. Two people out of hundreds responsible for more than half the community's violent deaths across 3 decades. That lines up with something else Bohm found. In a separate analysis of hunter-gatherer societies published in the journal Behavior, 42% of the groups he studied had, at some point, executed someone specifically for bullying or trying to dominate the group. Not for ordinary disputes, exactly the kind of person the whole escalation ladder, gossip, shame, exile, and finally execution, was built to handle. So the honest picture isn't hunter-gatherers were gentle. It's closer to this. Most people followed the rules without needing to be forced. The actual violence was disproportionately concentrated in a small number of repeat offenders. Exactly the people every rung of that ladder was designed to contain. And the Yanomami weren't the only people on Earth who figured out how to turn a fight into something governed by rules instead of chaos. Among the Inuit, some communities settled serious disputes through song duels, possibly the most polite form of conflict resolution in human history. Two men who couldn't resolve a conflict any other way would each secretly compose a song mocking the other, then perform it in front of the whole camp, often crowded into a large snow house. Whoever got the bigger laugh won. Dispute closed. Publicly, decisively, without a single punch thrown. It's the Yanomami's duel ladder, translated into comedy instead of combat. In Australia, some Aboriginal communities maintain a customary law system called payback. When a serious wrongdoing occurred, elders and the wider community would jointly decide on a specific, proportionate consequence for the person responsible. Sometimes that meant a supervised physical penalty, carried out in front of witnesses under rules agreed to in advance. Sometimes it looked closer to the shaming and exile you just learned about. Either way, the goal wasn't escalation or revenge. It was closing the matter and restoring balance between families in a way everyone present had already agreed to. In 1986, the Australian Law Reform Commission published Report 31 on Aboriginal Customary Law, formally documenting the practice. In some cases, modern Australian courts have actually factored payback into sentencing, a formal acknowledgement that this older system still carries real weight. Different continents, different climates, different languages, completely different explanations for how the universe works. And yet the same core instinct keeps showing up. Find a way to settle this. Through song, through wrestling, through gossip, through the escalating fear of being cast out of the group. Anything rather than letting it spiral into uncontrolled chaos. If deep dives like this, into how humans actually lived before anything we now consider normal existed, are your thing, go ahead and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it tells the algorithm to keep videos like this one alive. Nearly all of these systems vanished from most of the world within just the last few hundred years. In their place, courtrooms, written law, professional police, judges who've usually never met either person standing in front of them. As groups grew from camps of 30 into towns, then cities, then nations of millions, gossip simply couldn't scale to keep up. You can build a reputation in front of 30 people that they'll remember for years. You can't do that in a city of 10 million total strangers. So the informal power elders once held, power that rested entirely on the crowd behind them, gradually hardened into something more permanent. Chiefs, then codified law, then courts and professional police. All of it built to deliver fairness at a scale gossip could never reach. That trade genuinely bought something valuable. Courts and written law can, in theory, treat a stranger you'll never meet exactly as fairly as your own neighbor. Something no reputation-based system could ever do at scale. But it's also worth asking honestly, what got left behind in that trade? Being judged by 12 strangers reading a file instead of by people who actually knew you your whole life, for better or worse. In 2019, the primatologist Richard Wrangham published The Goodness Paradox, arguing that this exact kind of social pressure, communities repeatedly executing their most aggressive, most domineering members, generation after generation, may have done more than just shape behavior. It's a hypothesis, not settled fact, but according to Wrangham, this pattern may have pushed human biology itself toward being calmer over time. So, was that a fair trade? Justice never actually started in a courtroom. It started with something much simpler and, honestly, much more human: the fear of losing your place among the people you belong to. And if you've ever caught yourself doing the right thing, not because any law made you, but simply because you couldn't stand the thought of people you respect thinking less of you, that doesn't make you weak. You're running the exact same software your ancestors wrote hundreds of thousands of years ago from before any of this existed. And it's still working exactly the way it was built to.